Scotty, I gotta get that review and I need it now. So this one's a Patreon sponsored review. Got a couple of them I gotta get in this month. I say got to as if it's obligation. Actually, I really quite like getting the Patreon sponsor reviews because oftentimes it gives me a chance to talk about stuff that I wouldn't be covering otherwise, either because I don't have time or it's something that I otherwise wouldn't have looked into. In the case of this one, this is a movie that I had seen before, hadn't rewatched in a while, and didn't review when it initially came out, and that is Star Trek Beyond. So, suppose I should give a little bit of background information on my own relationship with Star Trek, since that is not one of the fandoms that I talk about the most on here. I've only kind of touched on it. Geez, it might only have been the Wrath of Khan review. Whew. But Star Trek is one of those things that has always kind of been around for me, and has been sort of my fandom adjacent, and like little bits and things in it that I like, but I've never done a dive into Star Trek. I didn't really watch much of classic at all. I grew up a little bit on Next Generation, but I actually haven't even seen the whole run of that. I've seen like what are usually considered to be the best episodes. I've seen all the movies, which was sort of my initial hook in. I had a VHS copy of Star Trek 4 growing up, and I've fairly enjoyed the reboot stuff. They're not perfect. There are niggles to be had, and I know a lot of long-term Trek fans cannot stand the reboot movies, except for this one. Now, this is going to be a slightly interesting thing because a lot of like serious Trek fans that I know really, really like Star Trek Beyond. And I wish I liked it better. So I got to figure out how I'm going to go about this. First off, let me say that I think I get, or at least I can relay what a fair number of people who I know who really like this movie say that they like about it, which is that a lot of them seem to feel that it is the thing that they kind of always wish the show was. And what I mean by that is, plot-wise, in terms of general structure, it feels like it could be a story that would be an episode of, the original show, a two-parter maybe, but it feels like an episode of the show done with the budget and the scale and the technical abilities that the show couldn't even begin to dream of, which, doing a big budget version of the show is oddly not something that the Star Trek movies have ever really been, and definitely not when you're talking the original cast and the continuation of the original series, because that was always what the movies were. They were a continuation of the later era of the career of these people. They never really tried to do the let's do that thing we used to do on TV but blow it up to screen size. They didn't really do that. They took those characters and then tried to do distinctly more cinematic things with them. So if you're a longtime fan of Trek, especially, classic original Star Trek, I get why this is a big appeal for you. Because I have nothing against original Star Trek, but I've only seen, some of the most well-regarded episodes, but I was never really heavily into it excessively. I don't have that link in, and as a result, I tend to do that thing that I do sometimes, which is to over-focus on the things that don't quite work for me. And yeah, professional buzzkill. But before I get to that stuff, let's talk positive stuff. So I've always liked this cast. I think that this cast, top to bottom, is really good for these parts. And I could name everybody, but I literally mean every single member of the Enterprise crew is really good. It certainly is, I think, the best looking of the three reboot Star Trek films. It eschews the lens flares that J.J. Abrams was so popular of. And it also feels like it makes better use of, for lack of a better term, camera moves that feel like they're in space, that feel like they are messing with gravity, that give you a sense of scope and of things. I think sometimes I kind of wish the camera would calm down a little bit when it's just two people talking, and yet it's still kind of swooping around the place sometimes. But, you know, for the scenes that are not the quiet scenes, it works really, really well. Director Justin Lin brought a lot of visual acumen to this, and it's a very good looking film, and there's a lot of cool concepts in it as well. I like the whole presentation of sort of the swarm of ships that the villains use, and I like the fact that like none of these have weapons on them, but the reason it's deadly is because there are so many of them, and they can just crash into you and tear your ship to shreds. That's really cool and really intimidating. They do an interesting job of giving most of the characters, you know, a good bit of something to do, because, you know, they sort of divide them up. So we've got, you know, the teams get split up. We've got Spock and McCoy. That's always a fun pairing. We've got Kirk and Chekhov. Wouldn't have necessarily thought to pair them inherently, but they work pretty well together. We've got Scotty and a new character who they're really good. She's doing a little bit of a generic sort of alien, you know, super literal, not quite getting English quite right thing, but she plays the part really well, so it still works for me. Uhura and Sulu get a little bit of the short shrift because they're basically just captured, but they still do, you know, these are both still very good actors, so they do well with the parts that they're given. And structurally, it gives us, you know, a way to sort of keep an eye on all the different moving parts of the story, because we can go from each of the different groups, as well as giving us a chance to highlight and single out these specific characters. So all of that works pretty dang well too. So what are the things that bug me about this movie? I'm sorry I put it off for as long as I could. So this movie did a thing that I've run into before. This is not the only movie I've ever encountered this, but at least for me, it feels like the most egregious, which is that it feels like we skipped a movie. And what I mean by that is it opens and we get Kirk's captain's log, and he's 3 years into his 5-year mission and kind of jaded, kind of ready to be done. Now, that is by no means an invalid story to tell with Kirk. You can certainly tell that story, and honestly, this is a pretty good telling of a story with him in that state. Why that bothers me is in the second one, in Into Darkness, he was so excited to go off on the 5-year mission. He was so pumped for that was what he was going to get to do. And in many ways, it felt like Into Darkness was, this is the last thing that he's going to have to deal with before he gets to go off and do the thing he wants. And we come in at the start of this movie, and he's already kind of over it and done and jaded. And I feel like we missed the movie where he's just exploring and just doing what he wanted to do and enjoying it for a time. It annoys me. It's not a sin on the same scale, but it annoys me for the same reasons that, like, when a film pivots on, like, the two characters getting in or saving a relationship, and then there's a follow-up film and it starts out and they're already broken up. It's like, well, what was the point? Or, you know, the really extreme example, again, this is harsher, but I still feel like it rings a similar bell. The Alien franchise, Ripley goes through all this stuff to save Newt, and then we open the next film, oh, and look, she's dead. You know, it feels like it negates or skips over or kind of brushes aside a lot of what the character was fighting to get to do, and we never got to see him just do it. So, and the fact that happens right off the bat, always, it sours me on the film in the first few minutes, which is annoying. Like, and I don't mean it's annoying that it's in the film. It's annoying that it sours my experience as much as it does. It's annoying that my brain can't let that go. Because like I said, there's no reason you can't tell that story. It's just, for me, we're missing another one in between before we get to that point. So that's one thing. And again, you know, it works. It's thematic. It's all that stuff. I also don't really like the villain for a couple of reasons. The first is, like a fair number of the movie villains, basically, really except for Khan, General Chang, and the Borg, the villains have never really been much to write home about in most of the Star Trek films. I mean, they just haven't. And I don't think Krall does a lot to reverse that trend. First of all, it's a waste of Idris Elba. They bury him in this makeup for most of it, and he's a good enough actor that he doesn't get lost behind the makeup, but I feel like I don't get a sense of what he actually brings to the table. I feel like the performance that we get is not dissimilar from what any, you know, Klingon of the Week performance would have been on Next Generation or DS9. So, I mean, that doesn't help. And then when we get the twist, that I get spoilers, I suppose, I'm about to get into. When we get to the twist of who Krall is and where he comes from, part of me is nitpicky on it because I feel like that's a big leap that they really don't explain how the heck that kind of happened. Like how he went from a human captain to this, and why he adopted a different name, and why he's speaking in a language that is not English. Like, it doesn't totally derail me. I'm like, I guess somewhere along the line there is an explanation, but the movie doesn't have time for it, and it's a big ask to get the audience to go with you on that. But I think, and I honestly didn't peg this until I rewatched it this time. I think what I dislike about it is, and this is not the only film I've seen this sort of thing in, I dislike this characterization of soldiers as being not only unable to leave the battlefield behind, but very vehemently unwilling to leave the battlefield behind. That they only find meaning in combat and in war, and they will kickstart that up again so that they can have purpose. And like, I'm not going to say that the people like that don't exist in life. They do, but it's one of those things where I feel like I see it way more than I'm comfortable seeing it, like as a trope. It feels like whenever you're dealing with a villain with a military background, like a formal military background, used to work for the quote-unquote good guys, things like that, it's so often you get, we never should have declared peace, or the peace wasn't worth it, or in the case of Krall, like, without conflict, there's nothing that defines us and gives us strength. And I guess I just feel kind of inherently uncomfortable with how frequently I see that characterization for soldiers. And I mean, it's one thing when you can address it like more properly with, and link it to something like PTSD or whatever, but the way it plays out here, it almost feels like it's taken for granted that, yeah, soldiers are like that. Like, his retort to Kirk for why he has to do this is, I'm a soldier. As if being a soldier means you can't be a peacekeeper. I don't know. It just kind of bugs me. And that's not like an angle that I have a ton of insight into. I was never in the military. And I mean, my grandfather was, but that's not really a part of my immediate family history either. So I don't, strictly speaking, I don't have a dog in that race, but it's still, I don't know, it just doesn't sit right with me. So that's the other thing on that. And it is a shame. It annoys me that basically these two, and really kind of only these two things, bother me about this movie, because I can watch it and see all these other things clicking into place, all the interactions working really well. Heck, I don't even like the song Sabotage that much, but I get a big grin the way it's used and comes back in this film. And, you know, the performances are fun and the interaction is great and the banter, McCoy is awesome, and there's all this really good stuff. But these two elements really do pull it down for me. And neither of these issues makes this a bad movie. It just makes it one that I feel like I should be enjoying more than I am. And I wish I did enjoy it more than I do. So I guess that's where we land. I really hope that the Patreon who sponsored this isn't mad at me, because I get worried sometimes when I get when I get Patreon sponsored things for things that I'm like, oh, I'm not gonna have the nicest things to say about that. Well, I mean, I think sometimes they actually very much deliberately want to see me kind of try and make sense of stuff. I think that's how I ended up with the Transformers the movie last month, but yeah, I'm gonna be honest. Whether it's sponsored or not, I'm gonna be honest. So, Star Trek Beyond, what did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. A whole bunch of stuff you can do. I mentioned the Patreon several times because this is a sponsored review, so there's a link to that. Plus, there's buttons, and there's a whole bunch of other links as well, and there's a P.O. box and all sorts of stuff. Check it out if you want to, but you know what? If you don't sweat it, because at the end of the day, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.